Hello, this is the second lesson in the series about developing an LMS system in K2 ERP. In the previous video, we created the ER model of the future online learning system. We thought through the entities, relationships between tables, entity types, directories, documents, and service fields. And today, we will show the next very important step, how to create a full K2 ERP component from a ready-made ER model. In other words, we are not just drawing a diagram for documentation. We take the ER model and turn it into the real structure of an application, with tables, models, grids, templates, routes, translations, and a basic interface. And all of this is created automatically, directly from the ER model. So, let's begin. Right now, in front of us is the final ER model for the LMS, the online learning system. The main entities required for the learning platform have already been created here. Some of them have the directory type, some have the document type, and some are used as linking tables between other entities. For example, we have a course directory. The course directory is needed to store the list of courses that can be used in different parts of the system. The same course can be included in a learning program, used in a training group, and have a description, duration, status, author, public availability flag, mandatory flag, and other parameters. So a course is not a one-time event, but a separate system object that can be reused many times in the learning process. The ER model also has an entity type called document. A document in K2 ERP is a record of a certain event or action that happened at a specific moment in time. Unlike a directory, a document usually records a fact. For example, submitting a practical assignment, student progress, a deadline, manual review, or the result of completing a course. These are no longer just reference data. These are events that can affect other data in the system. For example, submitting a practical assignment can affect the student's rating. Learning progress can affect admission to certification, and deadlines can affect the control of the learning program completion. That is why, in the ER model, it is important to correctly separate directories and documents. Directories describe stable system objects. Documents record events, movements, and results. Next, we see the status directory. We created a separate K2 entity, statuses, where all statuses that may be used in the LMS system will be stored. For example, new, active, created, archived, or any other status required for the business logic. This is more correct than storing statuses as a separate text field in each table. That is why we changed the status fields to status ID, so that entities refer to a single status directory. Thanks to this, the system becomes more structured. If we need to add a new status or change the status logic, it is done centrally. Linking tables were also added to the model. For example, tables for group teachers, group curators, learning program teachers, and learning program curators. Why are they needed? In a real LMS system, one group can have several teachers. One learning program can have several curators, and vice versa. One teacher can work with different groups or different learning programs. That is why a many-to-many relationship is needed here. This is exactly what separate linking tables are created for. They allow us not to limit the system to one teacher or one curator, but to immediately build a flexible model for a real learning process. Now we move on to the most interesting part, creating the component. We click the Create Component button. Here we see a form where we can specify the component name. The system also shows a list of all directories that were created in the ER model. In our case, these are courses, learning programs, training groups, job instructions, job training plans, competencies, document templates, statuses, and other entities. Below, we see the documents, and even lower, we see all the tables that will exist in the component. In our case, there are many of them, almost 4 dozen entities. And here is an important point. We are not creating all of this manually. We are not writing each table separately, not manually describing every route, every grid, every model, and every template. K2 ERP takes the structure from the ER model and automatically creates the foundation of the component. We click Create Component. Since the ER schema is quite large, the creation process may take some time, but it is still much faster than creating such a structure manually. After completion, the system redirects us to the page of the created component. Here we see its ID. Now we go to the development environment and check whether the component was actually created. We open the list of components components and see that the new K2 LMS component has appeared. The ID matches the one we saw on the website, so the first stage is successful. The component has been created, but for now, it is not fully ready to work yet because we still need to create the table structure in the database. To do this, we perform a migration. We enter the command flask-db-migrate with the ID of this component. The system finds all our entities, all tables, and all fields that were generated based on the ER model and creates a migration file. We can see that the migration has been created successfully. Now we apply it with the flask-db upgrade command. After execution, we can see that the migration has completed successfully and the tables have been created in the database. Now, for convenience, we clear the console, restart the server, and refresh the page. After refreshing, we can see that our LMS component has appeared in K2 ERP, and here we can already see the result of automatic generation. The system has created the main sections that correspond to the entities marked in the ER model as directories or documents. For example, let's go to courses. We can see a ready-made grid that the system created automatically. It already contains all the fields that we described in the ER model: name, short description, full course description, duration in hours, mandatory flag, public availability flag, minimum score, minimum progress, status, author, creation date, and update date. This is very important. We have not yet manually written a form for courses. We have not manually created a table, and we have not separately described each column in the interface. But the system already shows a ready-made grid that matches our ER model. Now let's look at what exactly K2 Builder created in the file structure of the component. We go to the K2 LMS component folder. Here we see service files, the init file, setup, requirements, and other files needed for the component structure, versioning, and further updates. Next, we see models.py. This is one of the most important files because it contains the generated database structure. Each entity from the ER model became a separate SQL Alchemy class. For example, we open the Courses class. We can see that a separate model has been created for the Courses entity. It contains the table name, primary key, fields, foreign keys, service fields, constraints, and comments. For example, a course has an ID, name, description, author, status, and other fields. We also see a foreign key to the course author. It refers to the K2 users table. In other words, the system automatically created a relationship between the course and the user who is the author. We also see service parameters such as onDelete, restrict, or cascade, which define the behavior when related records are deleted or changed. Separately, we can see comments for the fields. These are the descriptions that were added while creating the ER schema. Service fields have also been added automatically. In K2 ERP, service fields can be added directly in the ER model by clicking one button. These are the fields required for the correct operation of the system: who created the record, when it was created, who changed it, when it was updated, activity status, and other technical information. And all of this is inserted into the model automatically. This is exactly where the advantage of K2 ERP for the developer is clearly visible. In this component, the system automatically created more than 1,000 lines of code for the models alone. If this had been written manually, it would have taken much more time, and it would have been easy to make mistakes in field names, types, keys, or relationships. But here, the structure is generated from the ER model, which means the logic remains consistent. What we designed is what we receive in the code. Next, let's move on to the YAML files. The YAML folder contains grid files for our entities. For example, we open the YAML file for courses. Here, we see a ready-made SQL query. And it is not just a selection from one table, but a query with the required join relationships. For example, if a course has an author, the system can pull the author's name from the users table. Next, we see the fields block. Here, all the fields displayed in the grid are described: course ID, name, short description, full description, duration, flags, minimum values, status, author, and service fields. So what we see in the K2 ERP interface corresponds to this YAML file. And once again, the important point is that the system generated it automatically. The developer did not need to manually describe every column, every field type, and every display element. The basic structure is already ready. If a field is a reference to another table, the system can automatically create a drop-down list. For example, the author field or the status field can be displayed as a drop-down where the user selects a value from a directory. This is very convenient because in ERP systems a large part of the interfaces is built exactly on such relationships between directories, documents, and users. Next, we go to the Objects folder. We open the Courses object. Here, we see the Info Handbook method. This method is used for directories. It takes the current user project, forms parameters, and passes them to the base class K2 Handbook General. Then, the base class itself executes the SQL query, serializes the data, and prepares everything for rendering in the interface. So the developer does not need to write all the basic directory logic from scratch. Of course, if specific business logic needs to be added specifically for courses, it can be written separately. But the starting structure has already been created. This is the main idea of K2 Builder, to automatically create the framework so that the developer does not waste time on routine tasks, but instead works on what truly makes a particular business process unique. Next, we move to Views. Here, we have the routes that can be used to open the pages of our component. For example, if we go to the Learning Programs route, the system opens the corresponding section in the browser. We can see that the routes for directories and documents were also created automatically. For directories, Info Handbook is used, and for documents, Info Document is used. This means that K2 ERP understands the entity type that we specified in the ER model and creates the correct logic based on it. If the entity is a directory, it works as a directory. If the entity is a document, it works as a document. So the entity type in the ER model affects not only the schema, but also the behavior of the future application. Next, we go to Templates. Here, we have templates for all entities of our LMS system. For example, we open the course template. We see a Jinja template that inherits from the base HTML template of the K2 system. This means that we do not need to create a separate HTML page manually for each entity. For a large component, this is especially important. We have dozens of tables, and creating a separate template for each one manually would be time-consuming and inefficient. K2 ERP automatically creates the base structure, and the developer can later refine it where necessary. Next, we move to Languages. This folder contains the translation files. K2 ERP automatically created translations in Ukrainian, English, and Polish. For example, we open the English language file and see translations for fields, entities, and interface elements. This is very important for an ERP system because business applications often need to work in a multilingual environment, especially if the system is used not only in Ukraine, but also in international companies or foreign markets. Now let's check how the created component works in the interface. We return to K2 ERP, open the Courses section, and try to add a new course. For example, let's create a course called Learning Python. In the short description, we specify that this is a course for learning the basic syntax of Python. In the full course description, we can add more detail. Data types, while and for loops, basic language constructs, and other topics included in the course. Next, we specify that the course is mandatory. We also set the flag that it is public, meaning it is available to all relevant users. We specify the minimum progress percentage, for example, 65. We specify the minimum score, for example, 75. The publication date and service fields can be filled in automatically because they have the appropriate field types and system logic. Next, we select the status. The status is pulled from the status directory. If the required status does not yet exist, it can be added. For example, we add the status New, save it, and then immediately select it for the course. We save the course. We can see that the record was created successfully. The grid now shows the course ID, name, short description, full description, flags, minimum score, minimum progress, publication date, author, creation date, update date, and status. So we are already working not with a mock-up, but with a real table in the database. Data is created, saved, displayed in the grid, and can be edited. Now let's check editing. We open the created course and, for example, add the flag that the course has a certificate. We save it. We can see that the record has been updated. The update date has changed, and the system shows the current information. This means that the basic CRUD already works. We can create records, edit them, save them, and view them in the interface. Next, let's create a learning program. We go to the Learning Programs section. We add a new program, for example, also called Learning Python. We specify that the result may be a diploma or certificate. We specify the minimum score, for example, 75. We save it. We can see that the learning program was also created successfully. Now let's create a document. For example, we go to Deadlines. We create a deadline date. Let's specify, for example, the last day of July, Friday the 31st, and the time, 1700. We add activity, specify a reminder 3 days in advance, and add reminder text saying that the deadline is approaching soon. We save it. We can see that the deadline was created successfully, and this is already a document, a record of a specific event in the system. Other LMS documents work in the same way. Student progress, reviews, assignments, and other entities that were created in the ER model. Now let's check the status directory. We go to Statuses. We have already added the status New. Now we can add another status, for example, Archived. We fill in the name and description and save it. The status has been created successfully. Now we return to the course and change its status to Archived. We select the new status from the list, save it, and see that the course status has changed. This demonstrates how the relationship works between the status directory and the main LMS entities. Instead of manually entering the status text in each record, we use a centralized directory. This is more correct for an ERP system because it ensures order, control, and data integrity. Now let's check the translations. We switch the interface to English. We can see that the fields created based on the ER model already have translations. Yes, these translations may be basic and they can be improved manually, but the initial multilingual structure has already been created automatically. Now we switch back to Ukrainian. So, what have we seen in this lesson? We took a ready-made ER model of the LMS system and created a K2 ERP component based on it. The system automatically generated the component structure, database models, YAML grid files, objects, routes, templates, translations, and a basic interface. After that, we created a migration, applied it to the database, restarted the server, and saw the ready LMS component in K2 ERP. Then we checked that we can create courses, learning programs, deadlines, and statuses. We saw that directories, documents, drop-down lists, service fields, creation and update dates, translations, and basic record editing all work. And most importantly, all of this appeared not after long manual writing of repetitive code, but based on the ER model. This is the advantage of K2 ERP for fast business application development. First, we correctly describe the subject area: entities, fields, relationships, entity types, directories, and documents. Then, K2 Builder creates the technical foundation of the module, and the developer no longer wastes time on the routine creation of identical files, but can focus on business logic, complex processes, integrations, reports, and user convenience. Using the LMS example, we can clearly see that K2 ERP allows you to move very quickly from a model to a working application. One ER model, and the system already creates the foundation of the component. Of course, after that, the component can be further developed. You can add complex validations, course completion rules, ratings, certificates, learning scenarios, and roles for students, teachers, and curators. But the hardest starting point has already been completed, and this is exactly what significantly accelerates development. K2 ERP allows you to create complex business systems faster, in a more structured way, and with less manual routine work. That's all for now. Thank you for your attention. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave your comments, and watch the next lessons on development in K2 ERP.